I know a lot of Americans find Middle Eastern politics to be extremely complicated, so I thought I'd do a quick explainer of where every country is at politically. And the term Middle East isn't super well defined, but I'm just going to be doing the countries in North Africa and West Asia. Libya was pretty much a socialist country under Muammar Gaddafi, who took power in the late 1960s, and they were one of the most prosperous countries in Africa before NATO and the US toppled their government in 2011. Now the country is run by warlords, they have open-air slave markets, and millions of people are trying to flee across the Mediterranean. Egypt used to be pretty based between the 1950s and 70s when they were headed by a nationalist leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nasser invested in a lot of successful infrastructure projects and led the fight on behalf of the Palestinians against the Zionists. But pretty much ever since he left, Egypt has been an incredibly neoliberal country that's deeply corrupted by the US. Sudan had a revolutionary Islamic government for almost 30 years, very similar to what exists today in Iran. But they started to liberalize in the 2010s, and in 2019 they were overthrown by a US-backed counter-revolution, which has since devolved into a civil war, basically between warlords like Libya. Yemen was under a horrific US-funded Saudi Arabian bombing campaign for almost 10 years before China finally brokered an end to it. And this has caused an economically left-wing, anti-imperialist, anti-US, anti-Israel resistance group known as the Houthis to rise up. Today, they control much of Yemen and they're leading the blockade against Israel in the Red Sea. Oman has been a puppet of British oil companies at least since a British-backed coup in the 1970s. And the UAE even more so. It's basically a British and US oil state that wouldn't exist if they didn't support its creation in 1971. Same thing with Qatar, Bahrain, and Kuwait. The British military basically said we'll only leave if you create states or governments that do whatever we want. And they were all created with British backing in the 60s and 70s, and they've been puppets ever since. Saudi Arabia is a piece of shit. They are an absolute monarchy that's tied them in with the US global imperialist system and in many ways made themselves an arm of the US empire. Although, of course, they have their own interests and they're almost like an empire of their own within the Middle East. It's also hilarious that the US supports an absolute monarchy in order to defend democracy or whatever the hell they claim they're doing in this region. In Iraq, it was the CIA who actually helped bring Saddam Hussein to power. But the oil was still in the hands of the government, the state, and US oil companies didn't like that, so they invaded and toppled Saddam. This created a power vacuum which caused groups like ISIS to rise up, and the US has had to occupy Iraq ever since. Jordan is another British puppet that was created with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. Israel is another piece of shit. It wouldn't even be there if it wasn't for Western backing that placed it on top of the country of Palestine in 1948. And I don't even think I need to say anything about the country of Palestine other than that it's filled with the most tough and oppressed people of all time. Syria had a Ba'athist revolution or military coup in the 1970s that was led by Hafez Assad. His son, Bashar al-Assad, is still in power today, and Syria still emphasizes Arab nationalism and socialism. Which is why NATO and the US tried to overthrow them in 2014 when they launched the intervention of Syria and started arming and backing a bunch of extremist groups. But partially thanks to support from Russia, the Assad government has won the war, and now the US is only occupying part of Syria, the part with the oil fields, go figure. Lebanon, like many of these countries, was created with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, but unlike a lot of these countries, they had a real independence movement against French colonialism. They didn't allow themselves to basically be Western military bases like Qatar and the UAE. And very similar to the Houthis in Yemen, there's now a very powerful anti-imperialist, economically left-wing resistance group in Lebanon known as Hezbollah. And not only do they control much of the region, but they've also been leading an armed struggle against northern Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. Turkey is kind of like Saudi Arabia, but they're not a monarchy. They're also allies of the US, and they do protect their geopolitical interests, but they still have their own interests, which is why they've been getting closer with countries like Russia and China, even though the US doesn't want them to. Iran had a nationalist government in the 1950s that wanted to take all the oil that was owned by British companies and reinvest it in development. So the British and the US toppled that government and replaced it with a monarch, with the Shah. In 1979, the Iranian people overthrew the Shah with the Islamic Revolution, which was incredibly anti-Western. They basically said, we don't want any US or British influence, we want to be a Muslim country, and we want the resources of Iran to be reinvested in the Iranian people, not stolen by Westerners. And the US has been sanctioning them and trying to overthrow their government ever since. Afghanistan had a Marxist democratic government in the 1970s, which many people describe as the most hopeful time in the country's history. However, there were a lot of right-wing extremist groups in the rural regions of Afghanistan, including Osama bin Laden's group, the Mujahideen, and the CIA started funneling these extremist groups billions of dollars in arms. In order to try and stabilize the situation, the Soviet Union got involved in Afghanistan, backing the Marxist democratic government, but eventually had to withdraw when the Soviet Union was in the process of collapse. This allowed the jihadist groups who the US had been backing to take power of the country, and then the US invaded the country in 2001 to fight the jihadist groups that they themselves had funded. Years later, under President Biden, we would withdraw from Afghanistan, guess what, with the jihadist groups still in power. There's no Middle Eastern country that the US has destroyed quite like Afghanistan. I think it's even worse there than it is in Libya. Pakistan is where US-backed extremists would hide and then run over the border into Afghanistan and throw acid on the faces of girls who are going to school and learning to read. It's a strongly Islamic society that the US has always tried to use as a puppet. So there's a brief history of the Middle East. I wanted to make this 1 minute and ended up being 6 minutes, so I hope some of you watched the whole video.